We're diving deep into one of the most troubling issues affecting countries around the world: corruption. Transparency. International's Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI, has been a key source in highlighting countries where corruption thrives, often making life difficult for their citizens and stalling economic development. Corruption isn't just about bribes, it's about the manipulation of resources, lack of accountability, and how it affects education, healthcare, and even the safety of a country's people. In this video, we will cover 20 countries that face severe corruption issues. From Africa to the Middle East, Latin America to Eastern Europe, this isn't just about pointing fingers, it's about understanding the challenges faced by these countries and why change is so difficult. Let's begin with our first country on the list. Syria, once a prosperous country in the Middle East, is now a war-torn nation devastated by a brutal civil war. Corruption has been a key factor in the country's decline, particularly under the rule of President Bashar al-Assad, whose regime has been accused of siphoning off state resources for personal gain while the people suffer. The Syrian government, through its military and security forces, has maintained control by using state resources to enrich itself and suppress any opposition. Corruption within the government has led to the misallocation of resources. While the war has ravaged the country's infrastructure and economy, the conflict has displaced millions of people, and much of the international aid meant for reconstruction has been siphoned off by corrupt officials. Even as the war continues to devastate Syria, corruption remains a major barrier to peace and recovery. The Syrian people face an uncertain future, and rebuilding the country will be an immense challenge, given the deep levels of corruption that have plagued the state for decades. Afghanistan, a country torn by decades of conflict, has faced corruption at nearly every level of government. The rise of the Taliban in the 1990s, followed by the US invasion in 2001, created a fractured political environment that allowed corruption to flourish. Afghanistan's vast natural resources, foreign aid, and military spending have been misused by corrupt officials, warlords, and even some international actors. The government of Afghanistan, particularly during the US-backed regime, was riddled with corruption. Officials embezzled funds meant for development, and contracts were often awarded through bribery and favoritism. The country's security forces were often undermined by corruption, contributing to the rise of insurgent groups. Though the Taliban's return to power in 2021 has brought new challenges, corruption continues to be a major issue. Afghanistan's future remains uncertain as the country deals with the consequences of years of corruption, conflict, and instability. Belarus, often referred to as Europe's last dictatorship, has been under the tight control of President Alexander Lukashenko since 1994. His government has created a system where corruption is deeply embedded, largely due to the centralized power structure. Lukashenko and those close to him control state-owned industries, enriching themselves while the broader population faces economic hardship. The political system is highly repressive, with limited freedoms, and dissent is not tolerated. Opposition figures are frequently arrested or exiled, and the judiciary is manipulated to maintain control. Despite occasional protests, the entrenched corruption and lack of political freedoms mean that little change has occurred. The country's economy stagnates under these conditions, with no significant reforms or opportunities for the general population. The tight grip on media and communication prevents any effective opposition from emerging, allowing the elite to maintain power and wealth. International sanctions and isolation have worsened the situation, but Lukashenko's regime has managed to stay in power, further deepening the country's corruption problems. Corruption in Belarus is not just a matter of individual acts of bribery or mismanagement, but a systemic issue where power is concentrated in the hands of a few, and the rule of law is secondary to political loyalty. For ordinary Belarusians, this has meant a life marked by repression, limited economic opportunities, and little chance for democratic reforms. Somalia, located in the Horn of Africa, has struggled with corruption and instability for decades. Following the collapse of the central government in 1991, the country fell into a state of anarchy, with various warlords and extremist groups vying for control. In the years since, corruption has become deeply entrenched in Somali politics and society. Government officials, many of whom have been accused of embezzling state funds, have long used their positions for personal gain. Somalia ranks consistently as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, with corruption impacting every sector from law enforcement to healthcare. Foreign aid, which could have helped the country rebuild, has often been misappropriated by corrupt officials. Venezuela, once one of the richest countries in Latin America, is now facing one of the most severe economic and political crises in the world, and corruption has played a central role in its downfall. Under the leadership of Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro, the country's oil wealth was mismanaged and funneled into corrupt networks that enriched the ruling elite, while the rest of the population suffered. The government has been accused of embezzling billions of dollars in oil revenues, and Venezuela's state-run oil company, PDVSA, has been at the center of a massive corruption scandal. With government officials siphoning off funds, the country faces widespread poverty, inflation, and food shortages. The healthcare and education systems have collapsed, and corruption continues to be a major obstacle to the country's recovery. Despite the desperate situation, Venezuela remains divided, and efforts to address corruption have been stifled by the political regime. As the country endures an economic collapse, the people continue to protest and seek change, but the entrenched corruption remains a serious barrier to any lasting solution. Yemen, a country in the Arabian Peninsula, has been embroiled in a brutal civil war since 2014, and corruption has been a significant factor in the ongoing conflict. The war between the Houthi rebels and the internationally recognized government has led to the collapse of state institutions, and corruption has flourished in the midst of the chaos. The country's humanitarian crisis has been exacerbated by corruption within both the government and the rebel forces. Misappropriation of foreign aid, bribery, and embezzlement of public funds have hindered efforts to address the country's severe poverty and lack of basic services. The war has left Yemen with a destroyed infrastructure and a public sector unable to deliver essential services like healthcare, education, and clean water. Despite the ongoing conflict and corruption, there are efforts within Yemen to fight for a more just society. However, peace and stability seem distant as the country remains divided and corruption continues to hinder reconstruction and development. Equatorial Guinea, an oil-rich country in Central Africa, is one of the most corrupt nations in the world. Despite its significant wealth from oil exports, the people of Equatorial Guinea live in extreme poverty. The ruling family, headed by President Teodoro Obiang Nguema, has held power since 1979, enriching themselves at the expense of the population. The Obiang family controls the country's vast oil resources, diverting revenues into their private accounts. Transparency and accountability are virtually non-existent, and the political system is tightly controlled. Opposition parties are banned, and dissent is harshly punished. International organizations and human rights groups have long criticized Equatorial Guinea for its rampant corruption. But efforts to bring about change have been thwarted by the regime's grip on power. With little access to basic services and a heavily censored media, the people of Equatorial Guinea have little recourse to fight the corruption that dominates their country. Libya, a country rich in oil reserves, has been plagued by corruption and instability, especially after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. The civil war that followed Gaddafi's overthrow left the country divided, with competing factions vying for control over Libya's vast oil wealth. Unfortunately, this instability created fertile ground for widespread corruption. The political landscape in Libya is fractured, with different groups controlling parts of the country and the oil revenue flowing through corrupt channels. Militias and political elites siphon off state resources, while basic services like healthcare and education remain underfunded. The lack of a unified government makes tackling corruption even more difficult, and citizens continue to live in fear of both armed groups and government officials who misuse their power. For Libya, rebuilding a stable and accountable government remains an uphill battle, with corruption serving as a major obstacle to any real progress. Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, has long struggled with corruption, which has played a major role in its political and economic instability. After gaining independence in 1804, Haiti has faced continuous challenges, including foreign intervention, political upheaval, and natural disasters. Corruption has compounded these issues, leaving the country unable to break free from the cycle of poverty and poor governance. In Haiti, government officials often embezzle funds intended for infrastructure, healthcare, and education. The 2010 earthquake, which devastated the country, was followed by massive amounts of international aid, but much of it was mismanaged or stolen by corrupt officials. The result was a lack of real recovery for the Haitian people. Haitians have protested against their government's corruption and demand better governance, but little has changed. Despite the hardships, the resilience of the Haitian people shines through as they continue to fight for justice and accountability. North Korea is one of the most secretive and oppressive regimes in the world, where corruption runs rampant under the rule of the Kim family. Despite the country's isolation and severe sanctions, corruption has flourished, particularly among the political elite. The Kim regime maintains its grip on power through a combination of fear, loyalty, and manipulation of state resources. The country's leaders and military officials enjoy a lavish lifestyle, with luxury goods smuggled in from abroad, while the vast majority of North Koreans struggle to survive in one of the most economically isolated nations on Earth. Food shortages, poor healthcare, and limited access to basic services are common for ordinary citizens, while those in power abuse their positions to siphon off public funds. While the government tightly controls information and punishes dissent, the underground economy and black market trade provide small avenues for the people to survive. However, it remains a dangerous game, as corruption at all levels of government continues to perpetuate inequality and instability. Comoros, a picturesque island nation off East Africa, is burdened by political instability and deep-seated corruption, which hinder its development. The country is controlled by a small elite, and power frequently shifts among a few individuals, leading to a lack of governance continuity. Corruption has led to the mismanagement of state resources, and public funds are often diverted for personal gain. Vital sectors like healthcare and education suffer from underfunding, exacerbating poverty levels across the population. The country's political system is marked by frequent coups, creating further instability. This lack of continuity impedes the development of policies to improve the economy, which heavily relies on agriculture, including vanilla, ylang-ylang, and cloves. Unfortunately, corruption prevents effective management of these resources, stalling potential economic growth. Infrastructure is underdeveloped, and essential public services like clean water and electricity are often unreliable due to mismanagement and bureaucratic inefficiency. Despite efforts to combat corruption, the weak judiciary and entrenched political systems make reforms difficult. Many Comorians live without access to basic services, and the country remains one of the poorest in Africa. For any significant change to occur, the nation needs comprehensive institutional reform, a stronger judiciary, and more accountability from its leaders. The potential for improvement exists, but it requires systemic change and the elimination of corruption at all levels of government. Turkmenistan, a landlocked country in Central Asia, is widely regarded as one of the most authoritarian states in the world. Governed by a repressive regime, Turkmenistan's political system is marked by a high concentration of power in the hands of the president and his family, creating a climate of corruption that pervades all aspects of society. This centralized power structure was first established under Sapar Murat Niyazov, who ruled the country from its independence in 1991 until his death in 2006. Niyazov's rule was characterized by an overwhelming cult of personality, with the president's image glorified in every corner of the country, from the names of cities to the architecture. His successor, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, who took power after Niyazov's passing, has continued many of these policies, fostering an environment of authoritarianism and nepotism. Despite Turkmenistan's vast natural gas reserves, one of the largest in the world, the country's potential for economic prosperity has been squandered by the regime's widespread corruption. Rather than using the wealth generated from oil and gas exports to improve the living standards of its citizens, the government has channeled these resources to cement its own power. The country's leadership has used the proceeds from natural gas sales to enrich itself, while the majority of the population remains in dire poverty. Public services such as healthcare and education are severely underfunded, and the government's control over the economy and infrastructure leaves little opportunity for the private sector to thrive. Turkmenistan's political environment is highly controlled, with dissent stifled through a mix of censorship, surveillance, and repression. The government exercises total control over the media, with state-run outlets that serve as propaganda tools for the regime. Access to foreign news sources is heavily restricted, and the public has little access to independent information. The political system is sealed off from any meaningful opposition or reform, with any form of dissent punished harshly. Political rivals are either imprisoned or forced into exile, and any attempt at public protest is swiftly crushed. International efforts to address the country's corruption and human rights abuses have met with limited success. Although organizations such as Transparency International and Human Rights Watch have condemned the government's actions and called for reforms, meaningful change remains elusive. The deeply entrenched corruption, coupled with the government's monopolistic control over every facet of public and private life, has made it exceedingly difficult to introduce any real political or economic reforms. For the people of Turkmenistan, life remains a struggle under an oppressive regime that prioritizes the enrichment and power of the elite over the well-being of its citizens. The country's vast natural resources should have been a source of wealth and opportunity, but instead they have been weaponized to maintain a system of entrenched power. As a result, the Turkmen people continue to live under the shadow of authoritarian rule, with little hope for change in the near future. Nicaragua. Now we move to Nicaragua, a country in Central America that has seen its political and economic systems eroded by corruption. President Daniel Ortega, who has been in power since 2007, has been accused of using his position to enrich himself and his family, creating a kleptocratic regime. His government has used public funds for personal gain and political control with very little accountability. The Nicaraguan people have struggled under Ortega's rule, facing limited freedoms, political repression, and a lack of basic services. Corruption has become a way of life for those in power, and the judicial system is compromised, making it difficult for citizens to seek justice. The international community has condemned Ortega's regime for its authoritarianism and widespread corruption, but significant change remains elusive. The people of Nicaragua continue to protest for a more transparent government, but their efforts are met with increasing violence and repression. Chad. Chad, located in Central Africa, is a country heavily reliant on oil revenues. Unfortunately, much of this wealth has been misused by the government, leading to widespread poverty despite the country's natural resources. President Idriss Déby, who ruled Chad for over 30 years until his death in 2021, maintained a tight grip on power through patronage networks and military control. Corruption in Chad permeates all levels of government. Oil contracts and military deals are often used to enrich elites, while the general population suffers. Basic services such as healthcare and education remain severely underfunded, and corruption diverts funds that should be used for development projects. Although Chad's citizens continue to push for change, the political system remains tightly controlled. The military junta that took power after Déby's death has not made significant moves toward tackling corruption, leaving the future uncertain for the people of Chad. Zimbabwe. Next, we head to Zimbabwe, a country once seen as one of Africa's most prosperous. Unfortunately, corruption has played a central role in its economic and political decline. For decades, Zimbabwe has been under the rule of Robert Mugabe, whose regime was marked by widespread corruption and mismanagement. Though Mugabe stepped down in 2017, his legacy still looms large over the country. The political elite in Zimbabwe has used its power to embezzle state funds, divert resources, and undermine the economy. Corruption is rampant in both public and private sectors, particularly in mining and land redistribution. The country's once thriving agricultural sector has collapsed due to poor governance and land seizures. Zimbabwe also faces runaway inflation, which has devalued its currency and devastated the economy. Despite ongoing challenges, the people of Zimbabwe continue to fight for their rights and a better future. Protests against government corruption have been common, and there is a growing call for accountability. But reform remains slow, and corruption continues to stifle economic recovery. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, is one of the richest countries in terms of natural resources, yet it remains one of the poorest due to corruption, mismanagement, and conflict. The DRC has a long history of political instability, and corruption has played a significant role in exacerbating the country's crises. From the exploitation of mineral wealth to the misuse of foreign aid, corruption has hindered the DRC's ability to develop its economy and improve the lives of its citizens. The country has faced multiple civil wars, and the current government under President Felix Tshisekedi has struggled to root out corruption within its ranks. While there have been some efforts to address corruption, the deeply entrenched networks of patronage and corruption are difficult to dismantle. The DRC's vast natural resources, like cobalt and gold, have attracted international attention, but this has not translated into prosperity for the Congolese people. Corruption continues to siphon off the country's wealth, keeping it from benefiting its citizens. Eritrea. Eritrea is often called the North Korea of Africa because of its highly repressive government, which is led by President Isaias Afwerki. Corruption in Eritrea is not just about bribes, it's about the state controlling almost every aspect of citizens' lives. The lack of freedom, combined with a deeply entrenched patronage system, has created a culture where loyalty to the government is rewarded with wealth and power, while dissent is punished with imprisonment, forced labor, and exile. Despite its modest size, Eritrea is one of the most closed-off countries in the world, with no independent media, and the government maintains tight control over all sectors of the economy. The country's military is heavily involved in economic activities, diverting resources away from development projects that could improve the lives of the people. The people of Eritrea live in fear of their government, and reform seems unlikely unless there is significant international pressure. For now, corruption continues to be an insurmountable obstacle. Sudan, a nation in northeastern Africa, has been plagued by decades of instability, conflict, and corruption. The removal of President Omar al-Bashir in 2019 marked a pivotal moment, but the country continues to grapple with corruption in its political system. The transitional government that emerged post-Bashir struggles with entrenched corruption within its own ranks, hindering meaningful progress. Sudan's economy has been deeply affected by years of mismanagement and international sanctions that have isolated the country from global financial markets. Much of the potential wealth that could have facilitated recovery has been siphoned off by corrupt officials, further exacerbating the country's economic decline. The Sudanese people have shown resilience and continue to demand reform, but systemic change is a slow process. The country faces immense challenges in overcoming its deep corruption, and addressing these issues requires both sustained internal pressure and international support. While the transitional government has pledged to tackle corruption, the entrenched interests that benefit from the current system remain a significant obstacle to reform. Sudan's path to recovery is uncertain, and its ability to escape corruption and political instability will depend on its leadership's willingness to enact real change and restore trust in the political system. Azerbaijan. Next up, we head to the Caucasus region, where Azerbaijan is struggling with widespread corruption. The ruling elite controls the country's wealth and resources, leaving little opportunity for ordinary citizens to prosper. The country's oil wealth should be a blessing, but it has instead become a curse, with much of the wealth being siphoned off by those in power. Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, has been in power for over 2 decades. Under his rule, the country has seen increasing authoritarianism, with limited political freedoms and heavy censorship of the media. Critics are silenced, and opposition groups face constant harassment. Corruption in Azerbaijan is not just in government. It extends to the judicial system and law enforcement, where bribery is widespread. Despite international pressure, reforms have been minimal. However, there is hope among the younger generation, who are calling for greater accountability and transparency. Honduras, a country in Central America, has long struggled with corruption. The country's political and judicial systems are plagued by bribery and abuse of power. According to Transparency International, corruption permeates almost every level of government, from law enforcement to public services. The situation in Honduras is exacerbated by the influence of organized crime. Drug cartels and gangs have significant power, often influencing elections and government decisions. In fact, political corruption often overlaps with organized crime, making it incredibly difficult to enact reforms. the Honduran people face an uphill battle in trying to make their voices heard. Many citizens are forced to live with inadequate healthcare and education, and poverty rates are high. Transparency and accountability remain elusive, with little progress in reforms. Despite all this, there are individuals and organizations in Honduras working to combat corruption. They often face immense challenges, but they keep pushing for a better, more just society. It's a battle that is far from over. Don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts. The world is indeed diverse, and every place has its own unique charm. Thanks for watching, and see you in future exploration videos. Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from Knowledge Matrix, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.